A man shot and killed by his stepdaughter.
That's what police say happened to 49-year-old Anthony Hartmann. He was found shot to death in a basement in Des Moines earlier today. And his stepdaughter, 29-year-old Sera Alexander, is being charged with his murder. Police say it started as a family fight and then quickly escalated.
The victim's name is 49-year-old Anthony Hartmann. His stepdaughter is charged with his murder. Now, around 1 this afternoon, police first got the call about a domestic incident, and that's when they came out here to 7208 Southwest 17th Street. They came here. That's when they say they found the man's body here. As for the neighborhood, we talked to neighbors, and they said this is out of the ordinary.
There is a suspect with a gun in the house.
That call led to police finding a man dead in this home.
Very surprised.
Yeah, it was shocking.
It's kind of crazy.
Southwest 17th Street is described by neighbors as the place you call home. It's quiet and peaceful, and people say it's a place where you move and stay.
I wasn't expecting it after all the years I've lived around here. Nothing bad's ever happened basically until now.
I've been home all day today, but we did not hear nothing. We didn't know anything until the police cars arrived. He was a good guy.
Told us the weapon is in the hand of the suspect. Weapon is in the hand of the suspect. We're dealing with trying to get information. She apparently is quite distraught. We're doing the best we can right now. Okay, just a minute. Caller hung up on us.
That gray area played out for police as they responded.
I think the answers given to dispatch were just matter of fact and straightforward. We tend to, interpret those sometimes a little differently.
Police didn't say in which way it changed their approach, but because of this, more units were called and they took more caution.
Domestics are a little bit difficult as far as what the ripples are as they move on through time, but as far as our investigations, they sometimes seem a little bit easier to close up.
Before the stepdaughter was arrested, there was a perimeter around this area, and that's because, as you heard there in that story, police were trying to take as much caution as possible since they weren't quite sure what was going on. Last they knew is that the suspect had the weapon in their hand, but that is part of protocol to make sure that everyone is safe. Now, that stepdaughter is in Polk County Jail right now and is facing first-degree murder charges.
Police are also adding tonight that they don't believe Anthony Hartmann was a threat to his stepdaughter at the time of that murder.
I think the circumstances turned out to be a little different than everybody kind of thought at first blush.
Court documents reveal Anthony Hartmann was at this house Monday picking up some of his own property. The affidavit goes on to say 29-year-old Sera Alexander, quote, came home and went upstairs to get her handgun to confront Hartmann in the basement. That's when she allegedly shot him multiple times.
She came right out of the house and surrendered into our custody without any incident, told us exactly who she was, and left the weapon in the home as she was instructed.
Neighbors tell us they've heard fights coming from the house, but police say they hadn't been called out to the house recently.
At our fingertips, we have 6 months records, and there were, in the past 6 months, there's been nothing going on there other than medical-related calls.
A criminal complaint shows just over 6 months ago, police were called. It says, quote, Anthony grabbed his wife by the hair and pushed her head into the driver's side glass window. A no-contact order for this incident was lifted a week ago. At the time of the shooting, police say there were other people inside the home, all of which have been cooperative during the investigation, leading them to that first-degree murder charge for Alexander.
Once we got in there and got to looking around and examining the forensic evidence and conducting some interviews, we learned that it doesn't appear that Mr. Hartmann was any threat to anybody at that moment.
This was a fairly easy case for investigators to wrap up. In a criminal complaint, Alexander admits to shooting her stepfather. However, other records shed light on the victim's history and the family's relationships with one another.
Neighbors who live along Southwest 17th Street keep an eye out on their neighbors.
It could get kind of loud over there, but it hasn't been for a couple months since their dad moved out.
But what happened inside the home at 7208 is something they never saw coming.
And you really don't know what's going on behind closed doors either, and it's scary.
In a criminal complaint, Sera Alexander says her stepfather, Anthony Hartmann, came to the house to pick up his belongings. That's when she says she got out a gun and shot him several times in the basement. It goes on to say Hartmann did not assault or threaten to assault Alexander before she shot him. Police are calling it a domestic incident, but not a case of domestic violence.
It's fair to say that we ruled out self-defense last night.
However, police say Alexander referenced her stepfather's violent past while being questioned. Online records show Hartmann was sentenced to prison twice within the last 2 decades for domestic abuse. And just 6 months ago, he violated a no protection order against his wife by entering to the home he was killed in. The protection order expired last week.
If you look at his history, I think you can draw your own conclusions that there may have been some impact on the family, some of his past behaviors.
All things neighbors say they had no idea was going on behind closed doors.
They've always seemed like nice people, so I really hope, I don't know, they get their issues figured out.
Alexander is being held in the Polk County Jail on a $1 million bond.
Sera's amazing. No criminal background or any kind of substance abuse history at all.
Susan Hartmann says the charges filed against her daughter do not fit with the woman she knows.
It's just a complete shock. I still can't wrap my head around it.
Sera Alexander was active in the Renaissance Fair and part of a science fiction group that donates to child reading programs, now charged with the first-degree murder of her adoptive father, Anthony.
Tony has a very long, troubled history with alcohol and drug abuse, and he's very physically and emotionally abusive.
Susan says she suffered years of abuse by her husband's hand, and that Sera, her sister Amanda, and their brother all had to witness it.
It's always been very difficult to watch. He was more abusive to Mom than to us, but he was still very emotionally and psychologically aggressive to anybody who was near him.
The day of the shooting, Anthony went to the home to pick up his tools. The restraining order against him had just been lifted.
Sera didn't know this. She'd been gone all weekend at the science fiction fair. So all she knew was that he was in the house, and she would have thought that restraining order was still in place.
What happened next would end his life. According to police, Sera admits to confronting Anthony and shooting him several times with a handgun. Anthony was said to have been unarmed, but Susan says her daughter must have feared for her life to pull the trigger.
And he had heavy tools that could be very dangerous. We've seen him fly across the room faster than you could ever see anybody move, and go straight from being docile to being violent and ready to hurt.
Susan and her daughter say they can only hope the state will reconsider the charges while the legal process plays out.
I would like to see them dropped altogether. I think that there was reason for what she did, and there's enough history to support her response. I don't hold any anger or unhappiness with her for what happened, and I trust her instinct.
Sera Alexander came before a judge this afternoon with attorneys asking for more time to try her case.
Due to the complicated legal issues which have never been litigated before in this state.
District Court Judge Robert Blink will decide if the new stand your ground defense can be used here for the first time.
It essentially says that if you are in a lawful place and you have a right to be there, you have a right to use deadly force if necessary to defend yourself, even from a perceived threat.
There was violence in the home for a considerable period of time and inflicted against all members.
Defense attorney F. Montgomery Brown believes the new law is applicable.
You're presumed to feel threatened. If you have an intruder in your home and they remain there unlawfully, I read the statute to say, and you're presumptively justified in using deadly force.
Brown argues the defense should apply because this case will go to trial after the law took effect July 1st. Legal experts expect to see it used often in any self-defense case.
You're going to have instances at some point in time where two people are shooting at each other, and they're both going to say, I was standing my ground under the provisions of the statute.
Des Moines judge has ruled that a woman accused of murder may not use the stand your ground provision in her upcoming trial. The judge said she cannot use stand your ground because the law was enacted when the shooting happened. The bill signed by former Governor Terry Branstad was not a law until July 1st. Alexander's trial is set for December 4th at the Polk County Courthouse.
Tony's been angry and violent as long as I've known him. We've been married nearly 19 years. I filed for divorce in November because he's an alcoholic, and he's had drug addictions over time. And in the last 18 months or so, he had taken up meth. And with all of those addictions, he'd become even more and more unpredictable and violent. And so I filed for divorce in November. The no contact order was just recently lifted so that he could retrieve tools and personal belongings from the home. Sera did not know it had been lifted. She'd been gone all weekend. And I hadn't had a chance to talk to her, so she had no idea. And I'm certain there was some sort of, well, I don't know, because I wasn't there. We'll leave that at that. But the things to focus on with Sera is that she's involved in her community. She is working and has always maintained employment. She's involved in charity events, and she has absolutely no background at all that would lead up to this.
She was studying to be an EMT. That's what she wanted to do.
Yeah, in fact, none of us knew that that restraining order had been lifted, and none of us knew that he was supposed to come by. I think Mom said that she had called in advance and told our brother, but she didn't know that Sera would be home yet. So none of us knew that he had permission to be there. As far as any of us knew, he did not have permission to be there at all. And he was always very angry and violent and unpredictable.
But it had gotten worse in the last year or 18 months.
And I know one of the big things they say that there hasn't been any police calls out to the house in the last 6 months. That's because of the no contact order. Tony hasn't been allowed to be at the house. So that's why there's been no police calls in the last 6 months for domestic.
Charges against a Des Moines woman accused of killing her stepfather were downgraded on Friday. A judge lowered Sera Alexander's charge to second-degree murder, determining there was no premeditation. Alexander admits she shot and killed 49-year-old Anthony Hartmann last May, but claims it was done in self-defense. Her trial is set for next month, and if convicted, she faces up to 50 years in prison.